Today I want to talk about chemical bonds. Chemical bonds are extremely important in biology because they're what holds all of us together. You don't get to large-scale biological things unless you take tiny little pieces and you link them together. And the properties of the large-scale biological things are directly related to the tiny little links. So all of this is important. All right, so let's talk about exactly what the idea is. First of all, when we're talking about chemical bonds, we are talking about something that links two atoms together. So to do that, I have to start by thinking about atoms in a general sense. So atoms are pretty easy. They are made up of protons in the middle. They're also made up of neutrons in the middle. So you might remember protons have a positive charge, neutrons have a negative charge. And then they also have, floating around the outside of them, little electrons. Now, this is not a perfectly accurate atom from a chemical perspective, but from a biological perspective, it provides the information that we need, which is to say that most of the stuff that's in the mass of the atom is in the middle, and then there's a whole bunch of empty space with these tiny little electrons flying outside. But if what we're talking about is how two atoms interact with each other, then what ends up being really important is actually that empty space around it and how those things interact. All right, so let me draw two random atoms. For those of you keeping track, I'm putting 5 things in here, so I guess technically this is boron, which is really not that biologically useful, but don't worry too much about that. Okay, I made those electrons a little bit less symmetrical, so maybe that's more accurate. The point here is that the interaction is happening here. It's not happening between the nuclei of the atoms, it's happening between the electrons. And it happens in really one of 2 major ways. One of those ways is that these 2 atoms get close enough together that these electrons decide they actually kind of belong to both atoms. There are chemical reasons this occurs related to how the electrons are set up, but for the basics, you don't really need to know all of that detail. You just need to know that if they get close enough, sometimes they will share electrons, which means that these little electrons will actually fly around both of these nuclei. So there's usually 2 electrons, it's a pair, that flies around both of them. When that happens, we call that a covalent bond because they are bonded covalently. The key to the covalent bond is the shared electrons. This creates a fairly strong bond because the electrons want to be near both nuclei, so both nuclei need to be near each other, and it is hard to tear them apart because the electron thinks it belongs to both. So that's very important. The only thing with covalent bonds, though, is that those electrons don't always share exactly equally. So we're going to talk about that. So first of all, let me show you some instances where they do share pretty evenly. So carbon, for instance, which is like the most important compound for biologists because living things are made out of carbon, connects to another carbon. It has 2 electrons in this connection that are going around both of them. They are happy, they are shared, and they're pretty equal to each other. Carbon plays nice with its electrons. Carbon can also connect to hydrogen. Now, hydrogen doesn't even have that many electrons. It actually only has 1 to begin with. So when it shares with carbon, it gets 2, which is super exciting. And those 2 electrons share, again, around both the hydrogen and the carbon, and they're pretty happy. And in fact, it's really common in biology to have just long strings of carbon and hydrogen because that's what makes up most of it. And we actually get so bored, we stop drawing the C's and the H's. And so if you see things like this, that's just a long string of carbons and hydrogens. Sometimes they actually come together and make various kinds of loops. So this thump is actually a loop of carbons and hydrogens. Anytime you see just lines in a molecular structure, carbons, hydrogens. And every carbon wants to make 4 bonds. So no matter how many other carbons it's attached to, so this carbon is attached to 2 other carbons, then it also has 2 hydrogens. This carbon here is only attached to 1 other carbon, so it has 3 hydrogens, and it's just full up like that. Okay, that's sharing nicely. That is not what every atom does. So let's talk about another atom, oxygen. You're probably at least somewhat familiar with oxygen. It's a pretty important atom. When the 2 of them come together to make O2, it is a thing that we need for energy. But right now, let's just think about it as an atom. Oxygen has a slightly different balance with electrons. It tends to have more electrons on its side than the other atoms it's attached to. There are chemical reasons for that. You don't have to know them right now. You just have to know that it's off balance. So when it connects, and especially when it connects to something like this teeny tiny hydrogen, which only has 1 electron to begin with, even if it's got the 2 from the oxygen is so many more electrons because of the way oxygen works that it makes it just a tiny bit negative, which actually makes the hydrogen side a tiny bit positive. So now, what do we have here? We have 2 different things. We have an even bond and an uneven bond, or we very often call it a polar bond for polarized or off balance, and a non-polar bond for even. So non-polar is not off balance, it's even. Polar is polarized, so it's negative one way, positive the other way. And you can have different kinds of covalent bonds depending on how you have it. So we have all of these nice even carbons, but I could pop on the end of that whoop, an oxygen just like that, and that changes things. You can also see double bonds sometimes. So some carbons have multiple sets of things holding them together, in which case they're even stronger. You can get that with oxygen too. It'll have multiple things holding it together. There are a couple of other things you might find. This is only 3 atoms, and there's at least 6 that biologists care about. So let's talk about the other 3, which are nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and all 3 tend to be more polar. So if you see any of those, they're going to be a slightly more off-balanced. The nitrogen is fairly off-balanced. The phosphorus is definitely off-balanced. The sulfur is less so, but it is more off-balanced than carbon, and that can throw things off. All right, so that's our covalent bond with our shared electrons, and I'll leave some of this up, but I'll move some of these things because I want to talk about the other bond. The other way atoms can come together is if, instead of sharing the electrons, they decide it would work better if 1 electron went entirely to the other side. So let's say this electron jumped all the way over to this one. So now if that were to happen, this one would have 6 electrons, which changes something about it because it means it's more negative than it was before, which means now this one is a negatively charged atom. This one here has 1 less electron, so it is a positively charged atom. Ooh, when you have charged atoms, they are called ions. And this is an ionic bond. In this case, the electron moves from one atom to another. That creates the ions. And then what you have, you might say, well, how does this create a bond? Is you have a plus and a minus. And for anyone who has played with magnets before, when you have a strong positive and a strong negative, they whoop, stick together. Now, they don't stick together as strongly as they would if they were shared, but they do stick together. Now, from a biology perspective, there are not terribly many ionic bonds that are important to us. You might recognize some of them. For instance, Na plus Cl minus NaCl is salt. Really, what's key is the plus and the minus, because What happens to ionic things when they fall into water is that since they're not super strong, they actually kind of fall apart. We'll talk about more about that in a moment. And then they float around in the liquid. We're mostly liquid, so most of our ionic bonds are actually just ions floating around. So when we find ionic things, it is important to know what they are and that they're ionic. Other ions that you get to find in the human body include calcium, which is actually a 2+. You can also find potassium, which has a positive. Another important one, I'm trying to think of all the important ones, are magnesium, which is actually another 2+. So those are all important things you'll find in the human body. So you need to know that the ionic bond is not as strong, and it is ions, meaning charged particles. Those are the two ways that atoms stick together. Those are really the only two bonds. But we do have something else we call a bond, and I'm going to talk about why it's different. But it's important to know that these are the two major bonds that cause atoms to stick together. All right, I'm going to clear this up, and we're going to talk about the weird one, which is the hydrogen bond. This is a misnomer for a number of reasons. One, we call it a bond, but it's not about atoms sticking together. It's actually going to be about molecules sticking together. So that's really the wrong word. And we call it hydrogen because hydrogen is involved sometimes, but not all the time. And that's also important. Okay, so let's talk about how hydrogen bonds work. I said it's about molecules sticking together, and actually these are really built off of one very specific molecule that you're probably familiar with, which is this one with one O and two H's. Oh no, it's an H2O that makes it water. Do you remember what we said a moment ago about covalent bonds, which is what these are, and oxygen? Oh, we said oxygen is going to throw things off balance. It's going to be polar. So it's going to be a little bit negative up here and a little bit positive down here. So what happens if there's another molecule of water? Well, here's another O and some H's. So I've got my O, I've got my H's, I've got another slightly negative up here and the slightly positives down here. And didn't we just say something a moment ago about magnets and how they might connect to each other? So if I have a plus here and a minus here, these two things actually stick together. And in fact, water molecules, like if you have a whole lot of water molecules, like a glass of water, stick together slightly, which is kind of cool. Water is a little bit sticky. I know you never thought about it that way, but let's think about it for a moment. If you have, for example, a glass of water, let's see if I draw my glass and then I take my water, so I better make this blue. I'll get my big one and fill it up, and take it to the brim. Does it stop at the brim? Or does it go just slightly above it? It goes just slightly above it because the water molecules can stick to each other just enough to make that little bubble over the top. It's not too much. If you add too many drops of water, then the water falls over the edge and your glass spills. I can think of at least one more really neat trick for water being sticky, which is that some very tiny bugs can walk on water. If they're very skinny and they have very skinny legs and they're very spread out, they can take advantage of the water being a little sticky and they can sit right on it. But it's only a little sticky. If I try to walk on water, I'm going to fall right through, and that's a problem. So this is a hydrogen bond. So here's the real key to the hydrogen bond is, first of all, it's not a bond. It is between molecules. Second of all, it doesn't have to be hydrogen, but it does have to be between polar pieces. So the key here is that things have to be polar for this to work, because if they're not off balance, and there are no pluses and minuses. Hydrogen bonds occur between polar things. Neat trick about hydrogen bonds, because water is the basis for them, we also talk about them sometimes in terms of water. So If water is polar, that means other polar things might stick to water. Anything that has little pluses and minuses will stick to water. And that means that things that are polar also like water, and we call those hydrophilic. So what about things that are nonpolar, like long chains of carbons? They don't have any pluses and minuses. What's going to happen when they fall into water? I'll tell you what happens when nonpolar things fall into water. They do not mix well. They don't have the plus minus. They don't have the magnetic attraction, and they tend to separate from each other. We call that hydrophobic, like it doesn't like water or it's afraid of water. So if you think of oils are nonpolar. They're hydrophobic. They do not mix well into water. They're also made of long strings of carbon and are nonpolar. So when you're looking for things that are polar and nonpolar, you are looking for just a couple things. One of them is, does it have the ability to make hydrogen bonds, which means does it have little pluses and minuses, which means is it made of polar things? And remember, polar things include oxygen. They also include oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sometimes sulfur. If sulfur's with these other ones, definitely. If sulfur is just with some carbons, yeah, maybe. Those things, especially when attached to hydrogens, because hydrogen's tiny, it doesn't get to like make the rules. Those things are going to form hydrogen bonds. If what you see is mostly carbon, 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 or little things that are perfectly balanced, it's going to be nonpolar. No hydrogen bonds, does not mix into water. Quick thought, where does ionic fit into this? Well, we said that if things are plus and minus, they will attach to each other. Ionic things are by their nature always plus and minus because they are charged. So that means that yes, when you, I'm going to make that a normal width, add sodium chloride in here, the negative chloride will indeed attempt to attach to the hydrogen a little bit or be attracted to it. The positive sodium will be attracted just a little bit to the oxygen side. And so, as you probably know, salt and other ionic things mix well into water, and they are polar. I hope that is helpful, and you have learned a lot about bonds, not bonds, and how things stick together, which is going to be important because if they didn't stick together, we wouldn't have any biology. Thanks, folks.